One of the most legendary engines in NASCAR history only got one shot at glory before disappearing into obscurity. What if that engine dominated its qualifying races, set speed records, and terrified the competition, only to be killed by corporate politics before it could prove its true potential? This is the story of Chevrolet's 427 Mystery Motor, an engine so revolutionary, so powerful, and so shrouded in secrecy that people are still arguing about it more than 60 years later. It's a story about homologation controversies, NASCAR inspection games, engineering brilliance, and the corporate racing ban that changed American motorsports forever. Buckle up, because we're about to uncover the shocking truth behind one of the greatest what-ifs in racing history. But first, if you love deep dives into automotive history and want more content like this, make sure you hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell. Let's dive in. The W-Engine Foundation. To understand the mystery motor, we first need to talk about where it came from. In 1958, Chevrolet introduced the 348 cubic inch V8, the beginning of what would be called the W Series engines. These engines got their nickname from the distinctive shape of their valve covers, which looked like an inverted W. The W Series design was unusual. Unlike most American V8s of the era, these engines had their combustion chamber in the cylinder block, not in the cylinder head. The valves sat at an angle instead of vertically overhead, and this canted valve arrangement gave the engine better breathing characteristics than typical wedge designs. By 1961, the 409 cubic inch version arrived, and it quickly became legendary. The top trim street versions produced an astonishing 425 horsepower, and by the engine's second production year in 1962, it had drawn serious attention by cleaning up the NHRA's Superstock class. Bill "Grumpy" Jenkins-tuned 409-powered cars could run the quarter mile in under 13 seconds, absolutely devastating for the era. The 409 even got immortalized in the Beach Boys song 409, cementing its place in American pop culture. It was fast, it was powerful, and it was winning races. But Chevrolet engineers knew the 409 had a fatal flaw. The engine had a top end that worked better than its bottom end. In other words, it could achieve RPMs due to the heads that its bottom end could not handle. The 409 and its little brother the 348 had a bottom end made of normal materials that would live forever, under 4,500 RPM. But with a little tuning and aftermarket parts, the 409 could reach over 6,000 RPM, above its design limits. The heads could flow enough air to support high RPM operation, but the bottom end wasn't strong enough to survive extended use at those speeds. Connecting rods would fail, engines would grenade, and the truck block reputation began to stick. Chevrolet needed something better. Something that combined the breathing capability of a Chrysler Hemi with the compact size and lighter weight of their existing engines. They needed an engine that could fit in the upcoming C2 Corvette, while also dominating NASCAR's superspeedways. As early as 1961, the brass at Chevrolet knew that the 409-cylinder head design was at a dead end, and that a typical wedge engine had its limitations. They also knew that Chrysler's Hemi needed a complex valve train, and the heads were heavy and huge, precluding their anticipated fitment in the Corvette. So Chevrolet's engineers went back to the drawing board. They needed to create a new cylinder head design that could breathe like a Hemi, but in a more compact package. They came up with a compromise cylinder head that emulated the breathing of a hemispherical head with the lighter weight and size of a typical wedge head. While we take canted valve engines for granted today, the concept was revolutionary in 1963. The new design used individual rocker arm pedestals instead of a traditional rocker shaft. This allowed the engineers to cant the intake and exhaust valves toward their respective ports, similar to a Chrysler Hemi, while also twisting them to line up perfectly with the port locations. The result was ultra-high flow numbers without the weight and size penalties of a true Hemi design. The cylinder head featured intake valves measuring 2.19 inches and exhaust valves at 1.72 inches. Pop-up pistons gave the mystery motor a 12.4-to-1 compression ratio. The rocker arm ratio was 1.75-to-1, and the exhaust ports were round. When tested later, the heads showed impressive flow numbers. At 0.500-inch lift, the intake flowed 300.8 CFM, and the exhaust 196.2 CFM, exceptional numbers for 1963. The engine officially became known as the Mark II, distinguishing it from the Mark I, which was essentially a stroked 409 with enhanced components. The Mark II shared the same 4.84-inch bore spacing as the W Series engines and used a similar bore and stroke. But the cylinder head was completely revolutionary. In an internal Chevrolet memo dated August 21, 1962, from Vince Piggins to senior management, the orders were clear. 10 Mark II 427 cubic inch engines were to be prepared to be used at Daytona Beach in February 1963. Development was moving fast, maybe too fast, and that would become a problem. The homologation question. NASCAR had homologation rules requiring manufacturers to build a certain number of engines and make them available to the public before they could be used in competition. The number fluctuated over the course of the rule's lifetime, larger or smaller when convenient to encourage competition and manufacturer dollars, but 500 units was a rough average. For the 1963 season, NASCAR mandated that Chevrolet produce enough parts for 50 mystery engines. That was the magic number. Build 50 complete engines, and you're legal to race. But here's the problem. Did Chevrolet actually build 50 complete mystery motors? Most NASCAR historians claim there were 48 complete engines built, but crew chief Louis Clements and driver Rex White were at Smokey Yunick's shop when the big truck from GM dropped off the engines. Smokey Yunick and Rex White admitted that perhaps 26 engines were available, not 50. 26 engines, not 50. If that number is accurate, it means Chevrolet showed up at Daytona with an engine that technically didn't meet NASCAR's homologation requirements. They were short by nearly half the required number. This meant race teams had to scurry, trucking the engines back and forth to each other's garages before NASCAR inspections, repainting them and giving the appearance of having more engines than they actually did. It was a shell game. Musical chairs with million-dollar race engines. The teams would show one engine to NASCAR inspectors, then after passing inspection, they'd load it up, drive it to another team's garage, repaint it, and present it as a different engine for that team's inspection. NASCAR officials had to have suspected something. But here's the thing. They didn't have definitive proof, and more importantly, having Chevrolet compete with a revolutionary new engine was good for the sport. It brought attention, excitement, and manufacturer dollars, so the mystery motors passed inspection. The controversy was swept under the rug, and the Chevrolets rolled onto the track at Daytona with engines that may not have technically been legal, but nobody was stopping them. Daytona dominance. The mystery. Motor-powered Chevrolets showed up, and immediately everyone knew something was different. Junior Johnson and NASCAR rookie Johnny Rutherford each ran away with their respective 100-mile qualifying races. The Chevrolets weren't just fast. They were in a completely different class. Rutherford threw down a lap of 165.183 miles per hour, a closed-course speed record. Junior Johnson was hitting speeds over 168 miles per hour in practice, roughly 7 to 10 miles per hour faster than the previous year's records. Ford, Pontiac, and Mopar teams were stunned. Their inline valve wedgehead engines were incapable of processing gases as efficiently as Chevrolet's new canted valve Semi-Hemi. The mystery motor engine that Rex White ran pulled 540 horsepower on the dyno a couple nights before the race. Claims of 600 horsepower and more have been made over the years, but reliable sources inside the program peg the engine at around 530 to 540 horsepower, a respectable figure in 1963. For context, that was absolutely massive power for the era. Ford's big blocks were making around 480 to 500 horsepower. Pontiac's Super Duty 421s were in the same range. Chevrolet had shown up with an engine making 40 to 60 horsepower more than anything else on the track. The competition was terrified. This wasn't just a new engine, it was a game changer that threatened to make everything else obsolete. 5 mystery motor-powered Chevrolets qualified for the 1963 Daytona 500. Junior Johnson sat on the pole. Everything was set up for Chevrolet to make history. And then, disaster. Race day didn't go according to plan. None of the mystery Chevrolets did well in the 500, all falling to mechanical woes. Junior Johnson lasted until lap 26 when his ignition failed, while Rutherford, who had the best finish for the Chevy teams at 9th place, was not on the lead lap at the finish. At the end of the big race, newspaper and magazine headlines read, "Ford's sweep Daytona 500," as the first 5 finishers were blue oval Galaxy Scatbacks, Packing 427 wedge power, Tiny Lund was the winning driver. What went wrong? The bottom end was standard W Series 409/427 fare. Only 2-bolt main caps were used. This may have resulted in the failure of the engines during the Daytona 500. Remember what we said earlier about the W Series engines? Great top end, but the bottom end couldn't handle sustained high RPM operation. Chevrolet had bolted their revolutionary new cylinder heads onto a bottom end that was fundamentally similar to the 409, and it couldn't handle the stress of 500 miles at Daytona's speeds. Ignition failures, engine failures, reliability problems across the board. The mystery motors had dominated qualifying, set speed records, and terrified the competition. But when it mattered most, they couldn't finish the race. It was a heartbreaking result. But the season wasn't over, and the teams were determined to learn from their mistakes and come back stronger. Despite the Daytona disappointment, Junior Johnson's team kept racing with the mystery motor throughout the 1963 season. And once they sorted out the reliability issues, the engine showed its true potential. In the Ray Fox-prepped, Junior Johnson-driven 1963 Impala, the Mark I My-S shined. During the 1963 NASCAR season, the mystery motor-powered sedan racked up 7 wins, 9 pole positions, 13 top 5 finishes, and crossed the line in the top 10 14 times, all while taking part in only 33 of the 55 races. Think about that for a second. In less than 60% of the season's races, Junior Johnson's mystery motor Chevrolet won 7 times, qualified on the pole 9 times, and finished in the top 5 13 times. That's absolutely dominant performance. This was the engine operating at its full potential. This was what Chevrolet had envisioned when they started the program. The mystery motor was proving it could compete at the highest levels of NASCAR and win consistently. But just as the teams were hitting their stride, just as they were learning how to maximize the engine's potential, just as the mystery motor was proving it could be the dominant force in NASCAR, the rug was pulled out from under them. The GM racing ban. A month after the February 24th Daytona 500 event, General Motors officially quit sponsoring race cars and race teams. Fear of antitrust legislation was behind the General's decision to reduce its corporate profile anywhere it could. Let's talk about what was really happening behind the scenes. By 1961 and 1962, GM was getting roughly 53% of the entire U.S. auto industry sales, and the U.S. Justice Department became interested. They were watching GM, and should GM get close to 60%, they would consider breaking GM up. The precedent had already been set with Standard Oil years earlier. General Motors was being threatened with antitrust action, the government potentially breaking up the company because it was too dominant in the marketplace. GM's senior executives were terrified of this outcome, but that wasn't the only pressure. On January 18, 1963, Roy Abernethy, president of American Motors Corporation, spoke before Detroit's AdCraft Club. In his speech, Abernethy was critical of the automakers that recently withdrew from the AMA agreement and warned that their advertisements promoting speed and horsepower would draw unwanted attention from the federal government and negative public sentiment. In the hours that followed Roy Abernethy's speech, General Motors' top executives called a meeting to reevaluate its position on racing involvement. GM ultimately decided that its divisions were to immediately cease all race programs and discontinue availability of such engines as Pontiac's Super Duty 421 and Chevrolet's 427 cubic-inch mystery motor. In January 1963, GM Chairman Frederick Donner issued an edict demanding that all divisions, by which he primarily meant Chevrolet, Pontiac, and Oldsmobile, immediately withdraw from racing and abide by the 1957 AMA ban. The racing ban was immediate and absolute. GM's 1963 racing ban hammered Chevrolet's plans for the mystery motors competition in NASCAR and NHRA. Unfortunately, the mystery motor had one shot to prove itself, and then it was withdrawn into oblivion. Race teams that had been receiving factory support found themselves cut off. Engineers working on racing programs were told to stop all development immediately or be terminated. Parts orders were canceled. Financial support evaporated overnight. Meanwhile, Ford and Chrysler saw an opportunity. Lee Iacocca announced Ford's Total Performance campaign only 3 months after Donner's memo. While GM withdrew from racing, Ford and Chrysler doubled down, pouring money into their racing programs and dominating the tracks that GM had abandoned. So what happened to all those mystery motors? According to legend, GM rounded up all the engines after the racing ban, but as with everything about this engine, the truth is more complicated. Estimates of how many were made range from 17 to maybe 50. Tom McIntyre's is the only race version of a mystery motor that exists today, an engine that was built by Smokey Yunick and later sold at auction. Some engines disappeared into private collections. Some may have been scrapped. After the GM racing ban, under-the-table development continued with 396 cubic-inch versions in hopes they could be run for the 1964 series. These engines were track-tested in a Smokey Yunick Chevelle at Fort Stockton, Texas in 1963. 50 sets of parts were run for the Mark II 396, but they were never completed, and 90% were ultimately scrapped. But here's the thing, the mystery motor didn't really die. It transformed. The lessons learned with the mystery motor convinced Chevrolet that it could be revamped and delivered in 1965 as Chevrolet's new Mark IV Big Block. In 1965, the Mark IV 427 Big Block appeared with elements of the mystery motor's design. The Mark IV is more easily recognized as the 396 6.5-liter and 427 7-liter big blocks that would later include 1970's 454 7.4-liter. The canted valve cylinder head design, the compact packaging, the improved breathing, all of it came directly from the mystery motor program. Every big block Chevrolet from 1965 onward, every 396, every 427, every 454 that powered muscle cars through the golden age of American performance minus owed its existence to the mystery motor. The 1970 Chevelle SS 454, the L88 Corvette, the LS6, all of these legendary engines trace their lineage directly back to that revolutionary cylinder head design that debuted at Daytona in February 1963. The truth. So was the mystery motor illegal? Technically, probably yes. If Chevrolet really only built 26 engines instead of the required 50, the homologation requirements existed for a reason, and Chevrolet apparently didn't meet them. But here's the bigger truth. NASCAR turned a blind eye because having Chevrolet compete was good for the sport. The inspection games the teams played were an open secret. Everyone knew what was happening, but nobody wanted to be the one to blow the whistle. This was the era of NASCAR, before it became heavily corporatized. Rules were flexible when it suited everyone's interests. Cheating wasn't just tolerated, it was expected. As driver Darrell Waltrip would famously say years later about a different cheating scandal, "If you don't cheat, you look like an idiot. If you cheat and don't get caught, you look like a hero. If you cheat and get caught, you look like a dope." The mystery motor controversy wasn't about Chevrolet doing something egregiously wrong. It was about pushing boundaries in an era when everyone was pushing boundaries. Ford had their Cammer engine that NASCAR banned before it ever raced. Pontiac's championship-winning Super Duty 421 Catalina in 1962 wasn't exactly homologated, nor was Chrysler's 426 Hemi, which dominated the 1964 season. Everyone was bending the rules. Chevrolet just got caught in the middle of corporate politics that killed their program before it could fully develop. The mystery motor represents one of the greatest what-ifs in NASCAR history. What if GM hadn't issued the racing ban? What if Chevrolet had been allowed to continue developing the mystery motor throughout 1963, 1964, and beyond? The engine had already proven its speed in qualifying. It had shown it could win races once the reliability issues were sorted out. With continued development and factory support, the mystery motor could have dominated NASCAR for years. Instead, the teams didn't have the means to continue development without factory support, so they eventually shelved the mystery motors and switched to other power plants. Ford and Chrysler filled the vacuum GM left behind. The mid-1960s saw Ford's domination with the 427 Galaxies, then Chrysler's Hemi era, then Ford's return with the Torino Talladega and Mercury Cyclone, spoiler 2. Chevrolet was left on the sidelines, watching as their competitors reaped the benefits of racing success. It wasn't until the late 1960s and early 1970s that GM divisions would return to NASCAR in any meaningful way. And by then, they were years behind in development. The mystery motor could have changed all of that. It could have established Chevrolet as the dominant force in NASCAR years before it actually happened. Instead, it became a legend, a ghost engine that appeared for one brief, shining moment, showed everyone what was possible, and then vanished. The mystery motor had one shot at glory. It dominated qualifying at Daytona, set speed records, terrified the competition, won 7 races during the 1963 season, and then disappeared into history. But its legacy lived on in every big block Chevrolet that followed. Every time you see a vintage muscle car with a 396, 427, or 454 badge, you're looking at the mystery motor's descendants. That revolutionary canted valve cylinder head design powered an entire generation of American muscle cars. The mystery motor itself may be gone, but its influence is everywhere in classic American performance. And more than 60 years later, enthusiasts are still arguing about how many engines were really built, what the true horsepower numbers were, and what could have been if GM hadn't pulled the plug. Maybe that's the real mystery. Not what the engine was, but what it could have become. If you enjoyed this deep dive into one of NASCAR's most fascinating controversies, make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss future videos. Drop a comment and let me know. Do you think Chevrolet should have been allowed to race with only 26 engines? Was NASCAR right to look the other way? And what's your favorite big block Chevy powered by the mystery motor's technology? Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.